Thank you for coming to this presentation on migration. This is part of a kind of two-part event this morning where we have a walk looking at migratory birds and discussing some aspects of migration, so we're getting to see migration in real time. And then a second part where we talk about sort of the technical aspects of migration, like how it evolved, why it evolved, how birds migrate, how they navigate, things like that. So we'll dive into that. But introduce myself first. I'm Josiah. I'm a second year PhD student in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of New Mexico with Dr. Witt. So my research interests are broad. I've been interested in birds since I was 6 years old, and so basically every aspect of birds is interesting to me. But I'm particularly interested in how climate change is impacting bird populations and how birds adapt to changing environments. So I am interested in a phenomenon that's happening now where spring is occurring earlier and earlier in the temperate region. So that's basically anywhere outside the tropics, anywhere well away from the equator on Earth. Spring is happening earlier, and birds have evolved to time their migration and breeding with the onset of spring, when there's a big peak in resource abundance and food abundance in the temperate regions. So the idea is that birds are going to have to respond in some way as spring happens earlier. There's an increasing mismatch between when it's optimal for birds to breed and when they are breeding. And so this creates a mismatch, and this is sort of something that interests me and that I'm working on now. So I did a field season just a few months ago, finished a field season in the Sandia Mountains where I looked at reproductive biology of a number of different passerine birds that breed on the east slope of the Sandias. So when you go from like Tijeras up to the crest, you cover about 5,000 feet of elevation change, right? So you have spring happening about several weeks earlier at the base of the mountains versus the top of the mountains. So this means that bird reproductive timing varies quite a bit across the elevational gradient too. And so I'll share a couple of photos of just species that I found and saw up there over the summer, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the research that I do. This is a Grace's warbler. This is a really beautiful bird, kind of ornate little songbird of the ponderosa pine forest. So anywhere there's a ponderosa pine in the Sandias, you'll see Grace's warblers in the summertime. This is a migratory species, so a bird that breeds only is here during the summer and then returns to its wintering grounds in the fall. This is the yellow-rumped warbler, or the Audubon's subspecies of the yellow-rumped warbler, which is a bird of particular interest to me and sort of the focus of this first part of my dissertation work. This is a red crossbill. These are birds that you find as you go higher up in the mountains. Literally, they have a beak that crosses over. So the upper mandible crosses over the lower mandible, and it's an adaptation to extracting seeds from pine cones, from conifer cones. They can reach far in underneath the coverings of these seeds on cones and extract them. So you'll see these birds up here. They were coming down to or to a little water hole after a rain that happened overnight in one of the parking lots. I think it was between Balsam Glade and Tree Spring, if you're familiar. This is a northern flicker actively excavating a cavity in a live oak, actually partially living at least. Most woodpeckers excavate cavities in dead trees, but this bird was excavating one in a tree that was still alive. This is a male red-shafted flicker, nice red mustache stripe. This is a female broad-tailed hummingbird. This is another bird that breeds, so we have black-chin hummingbirds that breed at the low elevations in the valley, and then or lower elevations, and broad-tailed that breed higher up and have the capacity to handle lower oxygen environments. And hummingbirds are amazing nest builders. They build these nests that are tightly woven, spider web and lichen. This is a female Audubon's warbler. Showed you the male a few slides ago. This is a female Audubon's warbler building her nest in the crook of a juniper. I'm specifically interested in the nesting biology of the species. I'll talk a little bit more about that. This is the very beginnings of her nest right here. And she's got nesting material in her mouth. This is a young red-breasted nuthatch. You can tell it's a young bird because of the gape, which is this little yellow part to the mouth. This is a young white-breasted nuthatch, a little bit older. The gape is mostly gone. And here's, again, the species, the male Audubon's warbler picture I took this summer of the male singing at 10K Trailhead These are one of the most abundant breeding birds in New Mexico. They have a really extensive range. They go all the way up into the Canadian Rockies. And there in British Columbia, they hybridize with another subspecies, the myrtle warbler. And as a result of this hybridization, they've received this genetic variant from the myrtle warbler that has made its way through populations of Audubons in the Rockies, all the way down here to New Mexico. And some previous work by a master's student in my lab showed sort of the gradient or change in the frequency of this variant with latitude. So it declines from about 100% of the birds in southern Colorado have this variant, and none of the birds in southern New Mexico have it, and every frequency in between. So here in the Sandias, it's at about 50-50, we think, but we want to know like what sort of evolutionary dynamics might have given rise to that what we call a contact zone between these two genetic types. And so that's sort of the focus of my first chapter of my dissertation. We're also interested with sort of what visible trait or measurable trait that variant might be associated with. And one of our theories is that it causes different reproductive times in the two birds that look identical but have two different genetic variants. So one thing I'm looking at is reproductive timing in the species and associated genotype of each individual. So trying to see if genotype sort of predicts or is correlated with the timing of reproduction. So this is some preliminary data just on the timing. So this is elevation on the x-axis in clutch initiation day. The red is last year, the blue is this year. And you can see that in this year, reproductive timing changes by about 12 days as you go from the base of the mountains to the Sandia crest. So this just gives you an example of how much reproductive timing can vary across a single elevational gradient. So elevational gradients take the sort of changes we see across latitudinal gradients and compact them and condense them into the span of just a few thousand meters. And all of that change is happening over a very short spatial scale. So it's a unique way to study avian reproductive timing. And then there's other things we can do to see like what the genetic basis of reproductive timing is and how there might be potential for populations to adapt to the effects of climate change as spring happens earlier and earlier. So that's sort of a rough synopsis of my research right now. But the topic of today is bird migration. This is what you all came for, so we're going to get into that. Bird migration is really sort of a pilgrimage that birds make every single year, from wintering grounds usually to breeding grounds in a farther north or in the southern hemisphere, a farther south region where they breed. And that I want to give a general outline of what we'll go into. The first thing we're going to talk about is why do birds migrate? We're going to discuss some early theories on that were proposed to explain this sort of avian changing of the guard that people observed, where species that were there in summer were not there in winter, and other birds were there in winter that weren't there in summer. Fundamental aspects of migration, so sort of like defining migration as a term, and how do we separate it from other types of animal movement that we observe, such as nomadism. Overview of migratory routes, so we'll have a look at a global or continental picture of like different migratory routes. So scientists have divided up different parts of the planet into flyways to try and give a general understanding of the sort of paths that different groups of birds follow on migration. We'll talk about some of the most extraordinary migratory journeys out there, birds that travel thousands and thousands of miles nonstop without ever perching or stopping over. And then that sort of, then it's natural to ask the question, well, why did they travel so far? Why did they expend all that energy? Why did migration evolve in the first place? So we'll discuss that, and then actually discuss some of the ways that they're able to accomplish such a feat. And then how to study migration, and finally how to attract more migratory birds to your backyard to enjoy bird migration more. So if you go up into the Sandia foothills, like if I took these photos when I was hiking in April on a trail sort of on the south end, on the southeast side of the Sandias. So not really, sort of desert foothills, low desert mountains. And all of these species had just arrived back. So if you went up there in late April or May, or even now, you'd see a lot of these species. So black-throated gray warbler on the top left, black-headed grosbeak, western tanager, male western tanager on the bottom left, a paddock tanager next to that. These are all birds that you'll see in the summer, but if you go back in the winter, you'll see none of those birds, and you'll see a lot of these species. So mountain bluebirds, which are also common in the foothills on the west side of the mountains. White-crowned sparrows on the bottom right, and pine siskins. So there's this sort of seasonal, like I described it as a changing of the guard, where the suite of species that you see in one season changes quite a bit. So what's going on there is that birds are migrating, and they're going from one region to another, and birds that were farther north are coming south, and birds that were farther south are coming north in the summer. And the there are a lot of several great thinkers that kind of try to propose theories. So like Aristotle observed sort of change between seeing red starts in Europe in the summer and European robins in the winter, and he attempted to explain why there was this change in seasons, and one of them was that birds hibernated in the mud. So actually, I think one theory was that they morphed, so that robins morphed into red starts and red starts morphed back into robins. But there was also the theory that swallows hibernated in the mud, because when swallows returned from their wintering grounds to Europe, people would see them swarming over the water, and we see that here too, because there's more insects over the water, and so we see these big congregations, and so it's thought they must just emerge from the mud. But it gives you an idea of just how amazing migratory journeys are, because it seemed more probable that these species were hibernating in the mud than they were making these journeys of several hundred miles, right? So they're both kind of like maybe both remarkable feats. But and then later on it was thought that birds migrated to the moon and back at some point, which is a little bit wilder theory. And then the first time that people realized that birds did these intercontinental journeys was when this white stork, was shot down in Germany by German villagers, indigenous peoples of Germany. They shot the stork through the neck with an arrow, and it's now preserved in a museum. German villagers did not shoot the bird. I got that wrong. German villagers discovered a stork with an arrow through its neck, and the arrow was traced back to some indigenous group in Africa that had shot the stork. And so this was the first time that people made this connection that birds were flying between continents and between seasons. And then later in 1880, there was a scientist visiting from Europe. I think he was from the UK. He was visiting the observatory in Princeton University and was looking at the moon through a telescope and actually saw birds passing over in front of the moon. And this is because we now know a lot of songbirds migrate at night, and you can do this now. You can take a spotting scope and train it on the moon. Like you could do this tonight, and you would, in the course of an hour, probably see several birds pass in front of the moon. And then other people have since, or in the couple decades following, people started to notice this phenomenon of night or nocturnal migration. And there's one ornithologist who was on his farm in Wisconsin, his family farm in Wisconsin, and kind of was on a high point on the farm on a ridge, and heard several calls of thousands of birds migrating overhead. So that's kind of a rough timeline of how people have begun to study or realize migration exists as a phenomenon. Sorry, this is cut off a little bit of the text here. But we'll just define what migration is. So there's something called the annual cycle, which is something that some ornithologists dedicate their whole careers to studying. It's very applicable to conservation, because we now know that birds are affected by one dynamic, such as habitat loss in one season, and it can have repercussions for the rest of their annual cycle, the rest of the behaviors that they do in other times of the year. So migration kind of fits into the broader annual cycle, where many birds in our region go from wintering in roughly November through March, where they're just basically undergoing winter survival, they're just trying to stay alive during the winter, to migrating in the spring, to breeding throughout the summer, and then to migrating again in the fall. And there's some more nuance to this. Some birds also have a molt that happens annually, and that usually happens in between breeding and migrating, sometimes in between wintering and migrating also. And so this means that fall and spring are these transitional periods for many bird species. where they're undergoing a long journey, and that journey takes preparation, right? So birds have to have the necessary resources to prepare and to undergo such a long journey. There's also quite a bit of variation in migratory behavior, and we'll talk about why that is a little bit. So one example of this variation is there's canyon towhee on the left and Scots oriole on the right. So if you go birding in the foothills, any time of the year you'll see canyon towhees there, but only during the summer will you see Scots orioles. And so it's natural to ask, well, why do some birds migrate and some birds don't? One thing you could cue into is the difference in the beak shape of these birds. So this is a bird that has a conical seed-crushing beak, and the Scots oriole is a bird with a long, thin, pointy beak. And these beaks are adapted for different foraging purposes. So the canyon towhee is a seed eater. It crushes seeds mostly. It eats some insects too. But it can survive the winter when there's very low insect availability. Whereas Scots orioles are mostly frugivorous and insectivorous. They have a longer pointed beak for grabbing fruit, for grabbing berries, but also reaching into tree bark or underneath twigs to grab insects and insect larvae. And this is a bird that depends on fruits and insects, and so doesn't do well in the winter in New Mexico. And so they make this seasonal journey. So that's one way you could think about this. Migratory routes in general are sort of, in some ways it's artificial, right? Migration basically happens everywhere across the globe, some form of migration. But we can classify these migratory routes to help us understand how birds depend on certain features of the landscape to provide food resources or stopover habitats for them on migration. So looking at the old world, we have this this migratory route. Someone was asking on the bird walk today about migration in Europe, and so I was discussing this. This is the Strait of Gibraltar between Spain and Morocco, and it's a narrow ocean crossing. It's the narrowest point, and birds that can't land on water minimize the amount of time they spend over water. So this is sort of acts as a funnel. Like if you would want to go birding on either side of the Strait of Gibraltar during spring and fall, because it would concentrate a lot of birds through that area. So birds that breed up in the UK, for example, they spend the summer there, they migrate down through the rest of Europe, and then cross over the ocean here and down into Africa. And we have these tropical regions, right, that are all the way around. Basically all the equatorial terrestrial regions of the globe have tropical rainforests. It's one of the most productive and diverse habitats in the world. And it harbors a ton of resources. And so a lot of birds return to the tropics to winter because there's so many resources in the winter, and winters are warm. There are less fluctuations in insect abundance, for example, from summer to winter. They don't really have summer and winter, they have dry and wet seasons. And then you can see various other routes. So species breeding farther east in Europe will make sort of an island hopping crossing across the Mediterranean Sea. And then various, but you get the point here is that birds try to minimize for the most part their time over water. And then in North America, you have the Pacific Flyway here in the reddish shaded part. So this is basically the west coast and east of that to the Rockies. And then we have the Great Plains Migratory Flyway, which is where a lot of shorebirds we think of associated with coastal habitats, go to breed in the prairie pothole region of the Midwest. And then the Mississippi Flyway in yellow, so birds that tend to concentrate around the Mississippi River. Rivers are helpful for navigation. The Mississippi River runs north-south, birds can follow it. And also because there's so much water there, the ecosystems tend to be really productive, so there's a lot of resources for birds to stop over. And when birds stop over on migration, they need to refuel as quickly as possible to be able to continue their journey. And then the Atlantic Flyway. So coastal birds migrate along the east coast. Some migrate through the Appalachians. Birds leverage the fact that spring happens at different times across different elevations to take advantage of resources at different points on their migration or in different seasons. So here's an example of specific migratory routes. This is a whimbrel, a kind of football-sized shorebird, very powerful flyer, capable of really long-distance flights. and it migrates along the west coast from the coast of Chile all the way up to Alaska to breed. And, black-throated blue warblers, which are kind of a moderate distance migrant, go from the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, which is one of their primary wintering grounds, up to the White Mountains, as far north as the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where there's an ongoing long-term study of their breeding biology.
How are you today?
So, and we'll talk about this shortly, but in general, the reason there's this pattern from tropical wintering grounds to temperate forests and other landscapes is because there's an explosion of resources that happens when spring occurs in the temperate zone. So we have much less resources in the winter, but when spring comes, there's tons of flowers blooming, plants are leafing out, and there's a huge insect emergence. And so birds come to take advantage of that, and they escape competing with the hundreds of other species that are year-round residents of the tropical region. I'm going to try to play this. This is a map based on eBird data, which is an online community science platform where people submit their observations, and there's so many observations there now that eBird has been able to model the seasonal distribution, the seasonal movements of species on a really large scale. So this is the rufous hummingbird. This is a bird that we see here in Albuquerque during this time of year. So this is going through the months of the year. And the darker purple areas are the higher frequency, so more dense areas for rufous hummingbirds, or areas of higher rufous hummingbird density. So one thing I want you to notice, so they start out here in the mountains of Mexico, where they overwinter, and then they move northward very rapidly, but you'll notice that so this is where they breed. Most of the birds migrate along the west coast in the spring, and so we don't see any here in New Mexico in the spring. But then we see a lot now. So what's going on here is, the idea is that birds try to take advantage of resource availability seasonally. And they migrate early through the low elevations along the west coast, where flowers bloom pretty early. Winters are warm. They get to the Pacific Northwest pretty early to breed, and then they start back on their migratory journey very early, as early as mid-July. And at that time of year, since spring comes so much later to the high elevations, flowers are blooming at 10,000 feet and above. And so they'll migrate through mostly at the high elevations, some lower elevations like through town here. But they're basically forming this elliptical migratory route based on resource availability during the time that they're breeding, that they're migrating.
How far do they go?
So they go all the way up to almost to Alaska, to the sort of southern peninsula of Alaska. Yep. And the farther north birds go, the more precise their arrival time must be, because summers are very short. The growing season is really short in farther northern regions. And so they must arrive with precise timing, get their breeding done, and leave before winter comes. And this is why climate change is actually worse for birds that breed at high latitudes, because it's causing spring to happen earlier there, and the later they arrive, actually, the more they will suffer from missing the peak in resource abundance that happens as soon as spring comes to the Arctic region.
Are they evolving with that then?
There's some evidence that birds are changing their reproductive timing. So for migratory species, it's hard, because migratory species are often in an environment like the tropics where they're not getting any information about how the environment on their breeding grounds is changing. So compared to a resident species, if you're in the same place year-round and it gets warm early, you can just start breeding if you want to. Migratory birds are constrained by the fact that they can't breed if they're not there, so they have to arrive first. And I think the pattern that I've seen in the literature is basically that migratory birds are not arriving that much earlier, but the gap between when they arrive and when they begin breeding is shrinking. So you might arrive and you might fuel up and wait to breed for a week or so, and that window is shortening. but of course eventually it will shorten so much that now they're constrained again by their migratory arrival. So migratory arrival time will have to change, but there's not much evidence that that's happening right now.
Not yet.
It's a good question though. Yeah, great question. Another amazing journey is that of the Arctic tern, which migrates about 35,000 miles in a year. So they make this amazing, the longest distance flyers of the species make these amazing figure-8 journeys, where in the winter they breed in the northern hemisphere, places like Greenland and Iceland and the coast of New England, the coast of northern Europe, and they will migrate south towards the coast of North America, east coast of North America, and they take advantage of trade winds. So as they get closer to certain latitudes, they will catch trade winds that will propel them in the other direction, southeastward. And so they use that to generate, to be more energy efficient on their migratory route. And then they'll go toward the coast of Africa, catch trade winds that propel them in the other direction, and then arrive for the austral summer, right? So they breed in the boreal summer, the northern hemisphere summer, and arrive when summer is happening in the southern hemisphere. So they're getting the best of both worlds, essentially. And in the summer, they make a different journey where they will go west coast of Africa, and then, let's see, yeah, and sort of complete the figure 8, west coast of Africa back up, east coast of North America.
Do they travel with families?
They travel in groups generally. Terns are pretty birds that like to group together. They search for schools of fish, and they will sort of hover over the water and dive in and grab fish out. They have these wings that are really long and pointed. We call this a high aspect ratio wing, where the length of the wing is really long in proportion to the width of the wing. So it's a high ratio of length to width. And this is usually found in birds that are really efficient flyers and very maneuverable. So they travel in these groups, they'll hunt fish, and then they tend to migrate in groups, partly because they're leaving at the same time, right? So their migratory timing or migratory phenology is similar, just because they're the same species and have similar demands and have evolved similar behaviors. One of probably the most extraordinary migratory journey of any bird is the bar-tailed godwit, which is a bird that breeds in Alaska and makes a non-stop journey in the fall from Alaska to New Zealand. Which is a new record was set. They put trackers on these birds, these lightweight satellite trackers that allow basically researchers to get text messages from the birds where they are on the globe. And they found that there was one first-year bar-tailed godwit, the first journey this bird had made. It hatched that summer, and it made a journey of 8,435 miles without stopping. So it takes several days to do that. It's been compared to, I think, like a marathon runner running multiple marathons back to back for multiple days on end. It's the sort of physiological demands that this requires. So there's some amazing adaptations that birds have to be able to do this, and we'll talk about a few of those. The return journey in the spring takes them from New Zealand to the Yellow Sea on the east coast of China, and then they do a second leg of that journey all the way to Alaska. So they break it up in the spring. It's a slightly longer journey overall, but it's not nonstop. Means that the Yellow Sea is a really important stopover area. And from a conservation perspective, migratory stopover areas are one of the most important things for preserving migratory bird populations, because it's clear now that if birds do not arrive on these breeding grounds in good condition, and again we said the Arctic is a really short breeding season, they don't arrive in good condition, they can't start breeding right away and successfully raise young. And so stopover areas are crucial for migratory birds. And actually, China has conserved quite a bit of the Yellow Sea for shorebird stopover. So another bird is the northern wheat ear. So I took this photo in a town about 30 minutes south of here, on a little golf course, just west of the Manzano Mountains. This bird showed up in the middle of New Mexico. It's the first time this bird had ever been seen in New Mexico. It was a state record. And birds were going down in droves to see this bird, and it was remarkably tame. Like I was able to walk up 20 feet away or so and take this photograph of it sitting on its favorite perch, which is this little log in the golf course. So this is a small songbird, about that big. There are two breeding populations. One is Western Alaska and Siberia, and the other is Eastern Canada and Iceland, Greenland and Iceland, both. So these birds breed on the tundra, and they have two different populations. They're considered the same species, two different populations. Both of those populations winter in sub-Saharan Africa. So the birds in Alaska go from Alaska to basically on a westerly route, first westerly and then south. So they go across the Bering Strait, down through Russia, down through the Middle East, and into tropical Africa. And then the other population, the eastern population, goes across the Atlantic Ocean and down the coast of Europe, and then down into sub-Saharan Africa. So an incredible journey of, I think it's 6,000 miles one way for the Siberian birds, but it's a little bit shorter for the eastern population, but it's a trade-off because the eastern population has to spend a lot more time going over water, so a lot more time where they can't stop. Higher risk of encountering inclement weather or winds that make it hard to cross the water, higher mortality rates, versus a longer journey but more time over land, so more time to stop over. So this is. So this bird, yeah, so that brings me, good point. This brings me back to this bird that turned up here in the middle of New Mexico. It was an isolated bird. Yeah, it was the only bird there. But it makes you wonder. We have no idea which population it came from. It happened in spring, which is a weird time for this to happen. We think it's more likely that this bird took a wrong turn on its fall journey the previous year, maybe overwintered in the grasslands in South America, which could resemble southern Africa, so maybe felt right at home and then started making this northward journey and ended up here in New Mexico. So we'll talk about vagrancy in migratory birds, but quite frequently, like, birds will just, on migration, will just end up in places that they're not supposed to be at all. And this kind of makes it exciting for birders because it means you can see stuff on migration that's just incredibly rare. It's kind of like a treasure hunt looking for rare birds.
Can they catch up where they should be, or they sort of start a new population?
We don't know. We don't know, actually. So we don't know what happens to these birds. We have a very small sample size of vagrant birds that have been tracked. We know that a handful of vagrant birds have just ended up dying because they're not in conditions that are favorable for their survival. But we don't have there's if any cases of people actually using any kind of tracking technology to track where a rare bird goes, whether it can course correct and find its way back or not. Black-polled warblers are another amazing migratory bird. So this bird, it weighs about 10 grams. I'll see them. So when I grew up in the southeast in Georgia. I would see this bird a lot in the spring, but almost never in the fall. So it's a similar situation to the rufous hummingbird. But I'll show you what happens when I play this simulation. So this is birds that are overwintering in northern South America, highest density in Colombia, the east slope of the Andes. It's like it goes through here, some movement, and then the birds end up as far west as western Alaska. And they breed in stunted conifer forests where the tree line basically meets the Arctic tundra. So it basically, as the trees become more stunted, that are not they're in conditions that are too harsh for them to grow to their full size. So they're kind of these dwarf or elfin forests of conifers. And this is where these birds breed. And then, not to run it again, but so they'll go up there and then they're gonna, when they return, you'll see a very different pattern. So most of the birds do not come back through the southeast. Most of them end up will end up in New England before they just seem to disappear. So they're in New England, Pennsylvania, northern Midwest, but then after that, they just seem to disappear. So what's happening is these birds are actually choosing to go over the Atlantic Ocean. So they're not birds that can land on water. These are these small songbirds, but they are taking advantage of trade winds. So this is one exception where I said birds most of the time that can't land on water will avoid open water. These birds actually choose to go over open water because they save more energy that way by catching a tailwind over the Atlantic.
Thank you.
So why do birds undergo this what seems like a really costly journey from an energy perspective, from a risk of dying, risk of mortality perspective? Like, this is a very costly journey, and we know that migration evolved as a behavior. We know it's under genetic control, and for that behavior to evolve, there has to be at some point differential or an advantage in survival or reproductive success between birds that migrate and birds that don't. And so at some point there had to have been enough evolutionary pressure that this just extravagant journey arose in the first place. So there are benefits to it. One is that birds can exploit resources in the temperate zone. Like I said, as spring comes around, there's lots of resources available. Also, they may avoid competing with the numerous bird species that also reside in the tropics. But there's costs, right? Increased risk of mortality, physiological stress, reduced energy stores, things like this. So one of the good example of a cost of migration are these fallouts. So as weather systems move, one good regional example of this is on the Gulf Coast of the southeastern U.S. Birds that are migrating, making a crossing from Central America to the Gulf Coast, will sometimes encounter inclement weather, headwinds, and strong storms that make it really difficult to keep flying. But they either keep flying or they drop in the ocean and die. And so many of them will make that journey and then they'll just drop onto the beach on the Gulf Coast, just totally exhausted, pick whatever insects they can find in the sand, or they'll make it into the forest next to the beach. And so fallouts can be an exciting thing for birders because you get to go observe like all these species in one spot, these huge concentrations that you wouldn't otherwise see. And one example of that is you'll see like flocks of indigo buntings that turn up on the Gulf Coast, and you rarely see this bird in such large flocks. But there'll just be birds dripping from the trees in these events. So a good example of a bird that makes that Gulf Coast crossing is the ruby-throated hummingbird. Goes up and then comes back down. And this is an interesting pattern too, because just as a note, birds that, so at first all the birds arrive in North America, but the map is mostly orangish. There's some purple, but as summer goes on, that area with purple kind of expands. And part of that is that there are birds reproducing, so there are more juveniles in the landscape. But also, this is based on eBird data. So really, it's based on people seeing the birds. And if they don't see them, it doesn't mean that they're not there, right? So the idea here, and when I worked at a Wild Birds Unlimited store in Georgia for about 5 years, at the time I was in high school and through college, and I got this question a lot in the summer that people were saying, I'm not seeing as many hummingbirds as I saw last year. And over time, I realized that this was people usually remembering the end of the summer from the year before and comparing it to the beginning of the summer the next year. And what's actually happening there, I think, is that there are juveniles, so you're seeing more birds at your feeder, but also birds are using the feeder more. So females, when they're busy with reproduction, will visit the feeder for very brief moments, and they may be eating a lot of insects to feed their young, for example. But the majority of hummingbirds will not be visiting feeders as much. Whereas in the late summer, when they're preparing for migration, they'll just take advantage of any feeder that's available and they'll camp out there. And so that's when you see more hummingbirds, that's when more hummingbirds are reported to eBird, and that's why you get this pattern. So this is a video of hummingbirds on the Gulf Coast. Hopefully this will play. So I told you to make this crossing the Gulf Coast. This is a person working on an oil rig and holding a handheld hummingbird feeder out. And these are ruby-throated hummingbirds that are crossing the Gulf of New Mexico. And he's just holding a cup of nectar out. They're just coming in.
How does it know?
So probably they see the red as they're flying over, and this is weather that like birds would have to fly pretty low through. So when there's clouds, it pushes their migratory like altitude down quite a bit.
Do they come down for buoys, red boats and that don't have nectar?
It's a good
Or do
question. They may,
No?
yeah, they may buzz like
That
boats
could
that
be a
have
lot
red
up
on
and
them.
down.
Yeah, it's very possible. So there's sort of two theories for why migration evolved. One is that theory I told you about where birds are exploiting resources, this big bloom in resources that happens in the temperate zone in spring. The other is that it's kind of like hibernation and that it's an adaptation to seasonality. So to avoid harsh winters, birds leave an area. And there's favor for both, and it's still sort of ongoing. It's not there's no consensus on which one is true, but there's probably some truth to both. Yes, birds are exploiting resources and avoiding competition in the tropics, but when seasonality came about in the last 20 million years or so, birds would have already lived in areas far from the equator. And seasonality comes about, and these seasonal swings in temperature, which were not always present on Earth, come about. Birds would avoid that seasonality by returning to the tropics, by leaving their summer home. And then they would perhaps return back to those breeding sites as a way of escaping competition in the tropics. So it could be a mix of both. So another debate in this is whether migration evolved in the tropics or in the temperate zone. And I think it could have easily evolved in both, in separate cases and separate lineages of birds. And we know that migration has actually evolved separately in different families and groups of birds. It isn't one behavior that was then passed down through the Indian tree of life. It actually has come about on separate branches of the tree of life. And there's certain other advantages to remaining faithful to a breeding site. So to return to a site to breed, you have the advantage that you know where all the best eating spots are, you know where the predators are, for example. And so a lot of migratory birds will return to almost the exact same places to breed. And we call this breeding site fidelity. So if you have a hummingbird feeder, you may be seeing the exact same hummingbirds returning to that feeder the following spring. So a good example of that resource competition, just to illustrate it, like here's an example with hummingbirds. This is a map of hummingbird diversity, and there's tremendous hummingbird diversity in the Andes Mountains on either slope, the west and east slope of the Andes Mountains, and Colombia and Peru and Chile. And this is where the highest hummingbird diversity is. And so if you're a hummingbird there, you have to compete with 50, 60 other hummingbird species in the same area. Whereas if you're a hummingbird in New Mexico, like a black-chinned hummingbird, here in the valley, you're just competing with other black-chinned hummingbirds. And so all of the available resources out there, you're able to take advantage of. Whereas in the tropics, you're competing with a bunch of other species for those resources. And this is an example also with the ruby-throated hummingbird, which is the only hummingbird species. Like we get gypped on hummingbirds in the east. We have lots of hummingbirds in the west. One hummingbird species where I grew up in the east. And then 80 in like a single national park in parts of the tropics. So there's a little bit, this is a cool paper if you're interested in reading more on migration. This is by Ben Winger at the University of Michigan. This is on the theory of migration being an adaptation to seasonality, just like hibernation.
Does the more migratory birds, especially the ones that go further, are they tend to be birds that eat more seeds and insects as opposed to predatory birds that eat mammals and stuff and who don't need to?
That's a great question. I mean, diet definitely plays a role. Birds that tend to eat more insects definitely are more migratory. Birds that eat seeds are usually more able to stay in farther north regions because seeds are available throughout the year, or some have evolved this caching behavior. So like Steller's jays in the mountains here will cache seeds, and they'll cache thousands of seeds in some cases, and remember the locations of all of those in the winter. And birds that eat like small vertebrate prey, it's a mix. So there are hawks like Swainson's hawks that are here and abundant during the summer, and they all go to the Pampas grassland region of Argentina for the winter. Whereas red-tailed hawks eat very similar prey, but they're here all year long. So there's a lot of variation. It probably has something to do with how those species evolved in the first place and the behaviors they evolved. So preparing for migration, so we're going to kind of go through the steps of migration now. So birds need to prepare for migration because it's so energy expensive. So this is called, there's a German word for this. It's like one of those words in a foreign language that we just don't have like a good word for in English. It takes multiple words for us to describe it. This is the word Zugenruhe, which describes basically migratory restlessness. So if you watch really closely in early spring and you look at, let's say, the white-crowned sparrows, if you see like white-crowned sparrows in your backyard, you'll notice there are changes in their behavior. You'll see them perch in trees you never saw them perching before. They'll go higher up than you've ever seen them go. They'll vocalize more. They'll be more active in their foraging. So there's all these behavioral changes, and this gets at this idea of restlessness as birds prepare, in the case of the white-crowned sparrow, prepare to go farther north. This is triggered by externally by changes in day length, so changes in the photoperiod. As in early spring, as the days get longer, birds can sense that there are changes in the amount of light that they're getting in their eyes each day. Changes in food availability, so more insects, for example, on the landscape can trigger the same changes. And these changes internally manifest as hormonal changes that then drive changes in behavior. So hormones that are associated with reproduction, like testosterone and estrogen, are upregulated in birds prior to migration. They also begin to eat more. So if you watch the hummingbirds at your feeder now, for example, like black-chin hummingbirds, you actually can see them get noticeably rounder closer to migration. And so you'll see some birds that are probably going to leave earlier that are like particularly fat, and then some birds that are skinnier, maybe that are going to migrate later or just return, or just stopped overall migration. But they are putting on fat stores that actually the amount of fat they have like on their arteries would be very, very dangerous for humans. And so birds have evolved the ability to handle a lot of fat so that they can expend a lot of energy on migration. And then another question of preparation is when to begin. So we will talk about that in just a second. We talk about navigation. Actually, we'll come back to this. So there's sort of there's the when to begin migration, which is really controlled by changes in the environment. So a good time to migrate is when you have a good tailwind and when the skies are clear. There's no rain, there's no inclement weather. And so birds will begin migrating, and most songbirds migrate at night. So they will take off in the evening, just after sunset, if the winds are favorable, and if it's dry, it's not raining. And sometimes they'll migrate in inclement weather because they have to. So there's a trade-off between, if migration is really urgent, like if they've been there for 4 days and it's still raining, they may just start migrating no matter what. And a handful of birds will migrate even when there's a headwind, but most birds will wait for tailwinds to migrate. And so if you go out at night, actually you can hear birds, if you live in a quiet area, you can hear birds flying over at night. They're little flight calls that songbirds give. And the nights that you would want to go out on and hear that are nights where there's, at this time of year, a northerly wind and where it's not raining. And low cloud cover, like I said, actually drives the migratory altitude down a little bit, and so you might be able to hear them better on a cloudy night. So then physiological adaptations, birds have incredibly efficient respiratory systems. So they preserve, well, another thing is they preserve water. So if you ever look at like bird feces, there's white and then there's a darker matter. The white is uric acid. So they don't actually excrete very much water. So the uric acid is basically their pee. That's the filter from their kidneys that is filtered. That are doing the job of filtering and excreting uric acid rather than water. So they retain water really well. This helps them fly long distances, like in the case of the bar-tailed godwit. Birds have also very efficient respiratory systems. So mammals have bidirectional airflow. So we breathe air in, we excrete, we push out air out when we exhale. And the oxygen exchange just happens in our lungs during that. But bidirectional airflow means that there will always be waste air in our lungs. So there will always be some air that's not being used. And we can certainly learn to use our lungs more efficiently, but we'll never be able to rival the efficiency of birds. So in the case of many bird species, well, all bird species have unidirectional airflow. Air that goes in through their larynx and through their mouth, down their trachea, and it goes around basically around the body through air sacs. Birds have 9 different air sacs in different parts of the body. So it goes through the lungs and around and then back out past the lungs and through the larynx. What this means is they can store more air in a given breath. So air can be stored in those air sacs. Gas exchange or oxygen exchange only happens in the lungs, but they can essentially pump air through their lungs all the time, both on the inhale and the exhale, by the use of air sacs. And so lungs in birds are also incredibly efficient. They have the blood basically flows perpendicular to the flow of air, which means that the capillaries pick up a lot more oxygen than our lungs do. So for a given breath, they get a lot more oxygen in their body. And this allows birds, even with really high oxygen demands, like hummingbirds, to not only migrate far, but live as high as 16,000 feet in the Andes. So for a bird, hummingbirds have a greater oxygen demand than any other vertebrate animal, and yet they're able to live in these low oxygen environments. And my advisor has done experiments with hummingbirds and has shown that they can fly up to 40,000 feet above sea level, or in oxygen conditions that are equivalent to that, which is just unbelievable. Some people start to get altitude sickness at 12,000 feet, for example. So that brings us to, we've talked about physiological adaptations. Now we want to know, like, how do birds know where to go on migration? And there's really 2 parts to the map and to the navigation system. There's sort of the map, which is basically where you are on the globe, and there's the compass component, which is how do you know what direction to go in? And so that's sort of orientation and navigation. This has been thought about by ornithologists since the mid-1900s. There's a famous professor who was at Cornell in the 60s, Stephen T. Emlin, who did a lot of studies on bird navigation, and he used the indigo bunting, species right here, it's the male indigo bunting, to look at how birds find their way, how they know which way to go. And he put them, it's now called the Emlin funnel, because he developed this experiment where you put birds in a funnel, and then you put paper down and you put ink on the bird's feet, and he put a planetarium above, a mini planetarium above the birds, because he had this idea that maybe birds use stars to navigate. And he oriented that planetarium at different directions and simulated day length changes. And what he found is that birds cued in to day length changes that told them it was time to migrate, and then they cued into the orientation of the night sky to tell them which direction to migrate in. And he did that because he had these ink footprints of the birds, and he could calculate the average direction that they faced. So he knew that birds were, as they hopped around the cage, were facing northward when he oriented the sky. He oriented the sky as it would be in the northern hemisphere in the fall, and he made the day lengths a little short. He'd get shorter and shorter. These birds oriented south. And then he knew that in the spring they did the opposite and oriented northward.
So they've got these maps in their head somehow.
They do, yeah. And we'll talk about that a little more in a second. Learned migration is also, so there's birds that do migration instinctively and have to use those navigational cues like the stars, but there are birds that learn to migrate as well. And a good example of this is sandhill cranes, which migrate through our area in winter in the bosque. These birds migrate in family groups, and so on their first migratory journey, on both the north and the south journey, they will follow their parents. And once they've done that once, they now are capable of migrating entirely on their own. So they have this incredible spatial memory, and picking up on cues on that single migratory round-trip journey that they're then able to use the next season and for the rest of their lives and to guide their own offspring. So we talked about stars, magnetic orientation. Birds can also use the Earth's magnetic field to orient, and so that orientation, remember, is like the compass, to know which direction to go in. But it's also been shown that birds can use the magnetic field to know where they are on the globe as well. We'll talk about an experiment that showed that shortly. So that's the sort of GPS or the map aspect of this. So indigo buntings use stars. Reed warblers. So indigo bunting is a little more detail in that experiment. Basically, he discovered that indigo buntings use the orientation of all these. So the constellations are spinning around the North Star, right? So he wondered, what are birds cueing into in the night sky to know where to go north consistently night after night? And he found that they were focused on the North Star, and they were using the orientation of all the other constellations around the North Star to stay on their course throughout the night. So that's star navigation. Birds can also use polarized light from the sun to know which direction east and west is, and north and south. And then birds can use magnetic field detection. So the Earth's magnetic field is like about 1/100th the strength of a refrigerator magnet. So it's very low strength, and birds are still able to detect it, and they are able to orient to it, and also to use variation in the strength of the magnetic field to figure out where they are on the surface of the Earth. And this was shown through an experiment with reed warblers, where a number of reed warblers were captured in Sweden by some scientists at the University of Lund in Sweden who are famous for studying migration. They take these birds and they put them in a chamber where they have magnetic coils around the chamber that simulate the Earth's magnetic field in a town in Russia a few hundred miles away. So they thought, well, these birds are about to leave on their fall migration, so if they're going to orient south, they know that. But if they orient south and they think they're in a town in Russia, we know this is just a compass mechanism. This just tells them which direction to go. But if they orient back toward their original migratory route, then they know they're in a town in Russia to the east. And so they know actually where they are on the surface of the Earth, and not just which direction north and south are in that instance. And they found that they actually oriented back towards their original migratory route. So they were here, they were simulated as being here, and instead of just orienting south, they oriented southwest. So they know actually where they are on the Earth's surface. There's some complex things that happen to make them capable of sensing the magnetic field, but it has to do with blue light from the sky entering birds' eyes and exciting electrons on this molecule called cryptochrome. And those electrons become entangled, and they generate a small magnetic field that allows the bird to sense the Earth's magnetic field. We talked about migratory vagrancy earlier. There was a paper that came out a few years ago from a lab at UCLA. That studies migration, and it was really cool because it showed that birds there's a higher incidence of vagrancy, of migratory birds turning up where they're not supposed to be, when there's more solar flares or solar activity that causes these small changes in the Earth's magnetic field that mess with a bird's internal magnetic sensory mechanism and cause it to think that it's going the right direction when it's not.
What do city lights and stuff we put in the atmosphere, how does that affect? I mean, it's got to have some effect.
For sure. I think I have that in here.
Okay.
It may actually, that might be the next slide, so you might have just help me. So yeah, that's basically the next slide, so this is a great segue. So when we study migration, ornithologists have started using this tool of weather radar to study migration. And actually, if you look at weather radar over on a night in the fall, let's say, when there are winds coming from the north and it's clear, you'll see these big blue blobs. And this is actually not rain. These are birds migrating. Thousands or millions of birds migrating through the night. And the reason that there are these blobs is because when the radar goes out from the source in these major cities, it kind of does a cone shape. And so at certain altitudes far from the source, birds are not being picked up. And so you get sort of these blobs around the source of radar. But the idea here is that you can pick up birds on radar, and that scientists have developed ways to study migration through that. And this is Sid Gothrow, who's one of the pioneers of radar ornithology, of using radar to study bird migration and to answer questions like how many birds are flying on a given night, where is migration heaviest, and how does that relate to like weather patterns? How fast are birds traveling? And then sort of, where are the largest concentrations? And it can help to determine when to turn off lights in certain major cities. So there's this big program, it's called Lights Out, and then insert the name of a city. And so like Lights Out Cleveland, where in the fall migration, skyscrapers in Cleveland turn out the lights on the north-facing sides of the buildings. Because as you make the connection, birds use stars and sun to navigate, so they also must be cueing into other sources of light. And we've created a artificial landscape of light on the Earth's surface that is really pronounced. And you can see this on satellite imagery at night. It's basically a constellation, but on the other, on the surface of the Earth rather than in the sky. And birds are orienting to that, and they are ending up in the middle of cities and places that are not good to stop over on migration. And in the worst cases there, hundreds of birds will run into skyscrapers at night. So there was a big flight in Chicago. There's kind of a migratory funnel there too, where birds are migrating along the west coast of Lake Michigan to avoid going over the water. It funnels them through the city, and then on this particular night, thousands of birds were found dead below these skyscrapers, thousands of migrating birds. So this is a big issue, and the Tribute in Light, the 9/11 memorial in New York, you can actually see YouTube videos of what look like insects swarming around these beams of light, and they're actually birds. So now they turn off that every 10 minutes or so to let those birds that are trying to orient to that light and swarming around it disperse and keep going, and then they turn it back on. So there's ways that we've tried to adapt to that, but it's still a big issue. One cool manifestation of this research has been the Birdcast project. So Birdcast is made by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, also the same lab that has produced eBird and Merlin. And Birdcast is just a website. You can go on and look at the migratory bird forecast. So they've used previous data on migratory birds, both from eBird, and they combine that with radar data and an understanding of how migration varies, strength and flow of migration varies with weather, to predict how many migrants will be over your area or your county on a given night, and what sorts of species will be stopping over the next morning. So this is a map of migration where the lighter colors are the opposite of the map we saw earlier. Lighter colors are higher migration areas. This is precipitation in here, so you can see migration is lower in these patches. Parts of the continent will have very little migration at a given time. And so you can use this to figure out when it's a good time to go birding, and just to admire the phenomenon of migration. So this is 274 million birds predicted on a single night to be migrating across the globe. It can allow you to sort of predict. You can then look back over. So this was I gave this presentation in Santa Fe last spring, and so I had this stat up here of 26,000 birds had crossed over Santa Fe County the previous night. And this is estimated, these estimates can be pretty precise. There's some error, but they're actually quite precise from radar data. And then you get other things like what species were migrating: western tanager, black-hooded grosbeak, Pollux oriole. The most amount of birds over the county at one time was about 12,000 birds at a given time. So if you could peel back the night sky, so to speak, bird migration would be one of the most amazing natural spectacles out there, just to see the sheer numbers of migrating birds passing over at a given time.
How is that? It sounds like a lot of birds, but have they compared to 100 years ago, before there's many people out there, taking pot shots at them? I mean, how it's decreased? I imagine it's been a huge decrease.
Decrease in bird populations.
Populations, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a paper that came out in 2019 that was basically quantifying the net loss in breeding birds in North America, and that includes birds that migrate to the tropics. And it was about 3 billion birds over the last 50 years have been lost. So it's about 1 in 4 birds. So if you're in your backyard and 50 years ago you saw 4 birds, now you see 3 birds instead. So this is a really substantial loss. Most of it is due to loss of habitat, so it could be loss of stopover habitat, loss of breeding habitat, and a number of other factors. So yeah, I mean, certainly there are cases where overhunting, like in the case of the passenger pigeon, was a huge issue and caused an entire population to be wiped out. But we are having much more large-scale and far-reaching effects by destroying habitats and pollution and climate change and those sorts of large-scale changes that are happening. So this is really creates a driving need for this type of research to understand where the most important places for birds to migrate and stop over on migration are, and to conserve those places. Another way we can understand migratory routes better is through this thing called MODIS tracking. So MODIS is basically these miniaturized trackers that you can put on the backs of birds that are very lightweight. I did this when I was an undergrad for a project, and we put these little trackers on painted buntings, and we had like a rule, like only painted buntings that were 15 grams or bigger could have these trackers, and they're like half a gram. So it's a really small proportion of the bird's body weight. And we make sure when they fly away, they're very mobile. The harnesses, and they're basically a harness that fits around their legs, and so we make sure they're good to go. And these birds, it works really well because when you have a network of towers that look like this, put them on the top of buildings to have a bigger radius. They have a like 5-mile radius, 5 to 10-mile radius, depending on whether a bird's blocked by vegetation, right? But if a bird's just flying over within that 5-mile radius, the tower will detect it. And so if you have enough of a network of towers, which you see here on the left, you can build a route, a specific route for individual migrating birds. And the more data you get from those individuals, the more you get like a sense of the average route and the places that birds, each species is using to stop over. So it makes for like very sort of specific applications for conservation. This is a female painted bunting. This is the antenna of her tracker. Goes down just like that. And you can also track these same birds with handheld trackers. So you can track them on their breeding grounds, and then they'll leave on migration. So you have data from the breeding grounds on their local movements. And then when they leave on migration, you get data on where they're going. And this is only true for small birds. For bigger birds, we have satellite trackers and other types of technology that allow us to not have to put out towers, but just to get messages to phones about where birds are. And this has been used to describe a lot of really interesting things like nomadism or eruptions of snowy owls, for example. There are scientists that put trackers on snowy owls and understand their eruptions from Arctic regions into southern regions much better now. So finally, attracting birds. So I talked about migrant birds are mostly insectivorous. So the best way you can attract migratory birds is by adding some sort of insect-based or fat-based or maybe like protein-based source to your feeders. So if you just have seeds, you'll see fewer migrant birds. You might see like black-headed grosbeaks. But mealworms are a great way to attract more species that they pass through. Dried mealworms, there's also live mealworms, which can be a better attractant. If you're not squeamish, they're really helpful in attracting birds. And then bark butter bits, which is a fat-based substance similar to suet. This is basically a magnetic attractant for birds. So I think the Wild Birds Limited corporate has kept track of like how many birds this mixture has attracted, and it's like over 110, maybe over 150 species.
165 was the last number I heard.
Awesome, thank you. 165 species continent-wide. And there's hot pepper version if you have issues with squirrels or raccoons. So yeah, birds don't have the protein receptors in their mouths that register the capsaicin, and squirrels do, and we do. So mammals do, birds do not, so you can take advantage of that to help keep squirrels away. Suet is also a great source. There's a variety of different kinds. Super suet is really good. It's really protein packed and can be a great source for migrating birds. And you'll just get birds to this that you probably won't get to your seed feeders. Cylinders are a great feeder for both resident and migratory birds. This cylinder is the bugnut berry. This has dried mealworms in it, and it fits on this feeder. So this this comes off, and this slides directly on the feeder. So it's super easy to refill, takes very little effort. And then to enjoy, to see and enjoy migratory birds, you want to see them well, right? So binoculars are really helpful. There's two brands here. So this is Vortex. This is the lower end brand. I still think the binoculars are great for their price. These are about $300 to $99. This is Vortex Diamondback. I personally have this pair. These are an excellent binocular. Vortex has a great warranty, unlimited lifetime warranty. I've used it several times, and they're really good customer service. You send back, if you break the binocular, you send it back. They'll replace it for you, they'll repair it for you if that's possible. And then Zeiss is a little bit higher end binocular, but it shows in the quality of the glass. This is Zeiss Conquest. This is a really popular binocular among birders. And the key things you want to focus on with these binoculars are specifications. So binoculars have two numbers. So you'll see on here this 8x42 number. So 8x42. The 8 is the magnification of the binocular, so how much that binocular magnifies the image for you. And then the 42 is the size of the objective lens in millimeters. The bigger that is, the more light the binocular lets in, the more vivid the image is, and the bigger your field of view, which is really helpful because binoculars shrink your world down. You're trying to find the bird through them. So big field of view is very, very helpful. This is also an 8x42, I believe. And then this is a good field guide, the Birds of New Mexico field guide. It narrows down the range of possible birds to fewer species than like a bird guide to the birds of Western North America. So this is a nice little pocket guide to have with you in the field. And then I also do some private birding tours. If you're interested, I have business cards here. And I think that is it. I guess one other thing that's relevant to where we are in the world is, so we're in the desert, right? And so migration is a little different than in areas where there's lots of water and lots of continuous habitat for stopover. There's a place called Melrose Woods, which is a state-owned park, basically, but in the middle of the eastern plains of Mexico. And you'll see it from 5 miles away. It's this little stand of trees, but it's the only trees for miles and miles around. And there's a little bit of water. There's a spring there. There's a little bit of water. And I've been there a couple times in the last few months, and birds that you would never see in the fields, like western tanagers, were perched on barbed wire fences. And I saw a western flycatcher, which is a bird of the spruce fir forests and the higher elevations in New Mexico. And these birds fly over the eastern plains. They have nowhere to stop over, and places like this concentrate them. So these are called migrant traps by birders because you can go there and see high concentrations of migratory birds. With that, I'll take any questions.
Now, I have one. Is there an average range, I guess, of the altitude and the speed that birds migrate?
That's a great question. There is, and it depends on wind and tailwind, headwind, how fast the tailwind is. But go to birdcast.org and you'll be able to see exact stats on the speed, and that's calculated using
Birdcast.
birdcast.org.
Okay.
Birdcast.info, sorry, I forget. It's ebird.org, but it's birdcast.info.
Okay. Yeah. Because you said something about migrating days. It just seemed like, that's something that takes months, and they do it in days.
So, yeah, and it depends on the species too, like how powerful of a flyer they are. Those bar-tailed gobbets can fly at like 60 miles an hour with the tailwind, which still it takes a while to travel 8,000 miles regardless. But yeah, it's a great question.
Wow.
Anyone else?
So in the winter when the dark-eyed juncos come, so where do they come from?
Yeah, so this is something I haven't touched on, which is altitudinal migration. So because altitudes have the same effect on temperature in plant communities and environments as latitude, changes in latitude do. A lot of the dark-eyed juncos we see here in town, they're a mixture actually of birds that migrate down from the sandias. So birds that are breeding the sandias in the summer. And subspecies, so that's the gray-headed junco that breeds in the sandias. And another subspecies, the Oregon junco, that breeds farther north and west migrates south. So we get some mixture.
Blackhead.
Yeah, exactly.
So I live in Harris and I call my snowbirds because and I get both of them. Like I
Yeah.
get the blackhead ones and then I get the gray ones that almost have like the little rosy kind of ducks. So, I mean, they were there for this year they were there for a long time, and I kept thinking, when are you guys leaving? Because they usually leave earlier, so I was just wondering, I wonder why they stayed so long this year.
It's because they don't have very far to go.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
because they're literally just going upslope from your house.
Okay.
Like I found
Oh, that's
about
so funny.
25 or 30 junco nests. They nest in the ground. And 25, 30 junco nests along the crest road. So a bunch of tree spring, for example,
I
a
love
bunch
just
of cress.
exactly where
Yeah.
that's at. So yeah, it's not far from where I am, so they're just going,
Yeah.
oh, okay.
There were like 3 junco nests along 5 feet from the trail of the tree spring.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah. And then the Oregon juncos have a lot farther to go. So
Where do they go?
they go, that's a great, I'm not sure where their most southerly breeding range is, but up farther north in the Rockies,
Okay.
all the way up to the northwest, as the subspecies name implies. But I think they come as far south as like Wyoming, maybe to
Their song is so cool. Like even in the winter, I literally will open up my doors just to hear them. Because
It's beautiful sound, yeah.
Beautiful.
And you'll hear the gray-headed juncos doing that if you hike the tree spring or the crest of the spring. Yeah. Any other questions?
Anything you can do in your yard as far as like when you should break things up, or I mean just to help birds that are coming through?
Yeah, I mean, I think like one thing you can do if you have wildflowers is leave the seed heads on
Yeah,
and
leave the
dry
seed
out.
heads, yeah.
So that's lesser goldfinches that are passing through the winter. And American goldfinches that are arriving for winter will take advantage of that. Any kind of native planting you can do. So a lot of native plants have evolved to fruit when migrating birds are passing through. So it's been a sort of coevolution where plants will fruit at the times that birds migrate through for 2 reasons. One, the plants want birds to disperse their seeds, and the birds want to time their migration when there's food available.
Yeah.
So a good example of that east is the American beautyberry, but I'm not sure about the desert. One of the best plants. Juniper is a good one for sure. But yeah, that one you probably already have by default this year in your backyard.
I generally
yeah,
just
certainly
put the mealworms directly on the fruit.
plants.
They love it that way.
Dead trees, like
Some other birds,
I'd say like
birds
dead trees are
might
not
like them in a little
threatening
cup hanging up higher,
property,
but for roadrunners
or
directly on
property.
the ground is just fine.
They're a great thing to just leave up because birds that will absolutely use them. Any woodpeckers that are
That
coming through
works.
on migration, but also just at other times of the year.
Yeah, that works just fine.
Birds like woodpeckers and ground creepers will use them.
Kind of cleaning out your yard, you know, and they typically
Yeah.
die off for the winter.
I've got one of my
Is it
brothers.
better to sort of leave that through the winter, all that stuff, to let them, you know?
So yeah, I mean a lot of times those dead plants will harbor insect larvae.
Yeah.
So you'll see, like if you watch closely, flocks of bush tits as they come through will pick off insect larvae from dead or dying leaves. So if you don't mind the look, like that's a good
Easier
thing
for
to do,
me.
just to leave.
And then maybe clean it up in the spring when other things are flowering.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely a good thing to use.
Yeah.
I love those bush tits.
Yeah,
And
they're
they
great.
come in groups,
Uh-huh.
you know?
Yeah, and they move fast.
And they're so cute,
Yeah.
little fuzzy faces.
We're really fortunate to have that bird here. And so there's a whole group of birds called long-tailed tits, and it's a whole family, and that's the only member of the family in North America. All the others are old world species, so it's a really good bird. We're lucky to have it. Yeah.
So those cranes that lost their parents and can't learn, do they become domesticated? Is that part of the reason for some of the ones who stick around?
Overwintering, yeah.
Yeah.
So I bet they probably just follow other members of the flock still. But I would also guess that some of that sticking around is due to like supplemental feeding.
Yeah.
So like people putting out corn for them or grain.
Yeah.
Or just the fact that like crops are grown here could have influence on their spending the summer or staying longer than they normally do. That's a good question. There's a great project with whooping cranes. So whooping cranes are the other crane species we have in North America, and they were once abundant and were hunted nearly to extinction. And there was a captive breeding program where they took cranes from the wild. They were down to less than 100 individuals, I think, in the wild. raised these young cranes, and then an ultralight pilot would actually take them from the reproductive facility in Florida to their breeding grounds, or sorry, from their wintering facility in Florida where they're doing this captive breeding program, to their wintering grounds in Wisconsin, and then back again. They follow that ultralight for one round trip journey, and then they're on their own after that. Yeah, awesome. Well, I'll be around if you want to chat more, but thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Why did they hunt wolves?
They hunted because
Did they eat them?
So it's mostly eating, and people still hunt cranes here in New Mexico. It's a big thing. We have the Museum of Southwestern Biology at University of New Mexico, where we have collections of bird specimens, and we'll work with hunters who will take the meat from those cranes, and we'll take the skins and we'll prepare it. So we have a series of sandhill cranes, and people have actually driven the dissertation work of a few of my lab mates, studying variation in crane morphology and in two subspecies, the lesser and greater sandhill crane. People do eat them, yeah. They have very large flight muscles. They're
I
very
remember
powerful.
seeing whoopers down at the Bosky.
They're very
early
rare still.
90s.
Oh, you remember seeing them?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
They're easy to spot.
Yeah, they are. They're big. They're even bigger than sandhill cranes. Yeah, I've seen them once on the Gulf Coast in Texas.
I used to live in Wisconsin, and they were there.
Yeah, in the breeding season.
Yeah.
The population is growing, so there's hope that it'll become a more
That's
regular
good. Yeah.
site migration.
In the lesser cranes, where is it in Nebraska they cross the river?
So they
Yeah.
Platte River. Yeah, for sandhill cranes.
I've been up there for that, and it is unbelievable, just miles and miles of river.
I think that's isn't that like the biggest migration or
I
the biggest
think so.
concentration of cranes in the world, or of sandhill cranes? Yeah, we're
Cabela's, I
fortunate
think,
to
got
have
their
some.
start there.
What's that?
I think Cabela's got their start there. The birding world and
I see, because there's a festival, like the Festival of the
Yeah.
Sandhill Cranes.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So cool.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Just one last question.
Yeah.
The whole